Thank you so much, Micah. That was beautiful. And friends, it is so good to be with you this morning. As Jimmy mentioned, I hope that you have had a wonderful weekend and that you have been able to get outside and enjoy the signs of hope and spring that are coming up all around us. What a wonderful weekend it's been. This Sunday, we are continuing our Lenten sermon series here at Second, which is entitled Rootedness. Throughout this Lenten season, we are exploring what biblical cultures and Indigenous wisdom can teach us about community, about cooperation, and about new ways of being in relationship with creation, our Creator, and with one another. Last week, Paul kicked off this sermon series, and in his sermon, he talked about stories. He told us how stories form us, how they shape our worldviews, and how they inform how we see ourselves and one another, often in deep and unconscious ways. Stories have an impact not just when we tell them, but when we are told them as part of our own story. In his sermon, Paul spent time comparing and contrasting two different creation stories. The first story that he looked at was the Indigenous story of Sky Woman and Turtle Island. And he took that story and he compared and contrasted it with another creation story, the second creation account that is found in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. He talked about these different stories and how they have shaped both Indigenous and Western worldviews about creation, about women, and about our relationship to the earth and to one another. This week, we're going to turn our attention to another creation story. As many of you may know, the Bible has not one, but actually two different accounts of creation. This week, we're going to turn our attention to the first creation story, which is found beginning in Genesis chapter 1. If you have a Bible at home, I invite you to go ahead and open that up. And if not, don't worry. We'll be retelling the story together. Now, this first account of creation begins in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And you probably know how the story begins. In the beginning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was without shape or form, and it was dark over the deep sea. And God's wind swept over the deep waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Light appeared, and God saw how good the light was. God separated the light from the darkness, and God named the light day and the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. On the second day, God created a dome above the waters to separate them, the waters above from the waters below, and God named this dome Sky. On the third day, God separated the waters once again, and from this separation, land appeared. God named the dry land earth, and God saw how good it all was. God began to engage in more creation. He planted plants with seeds and trees with fruit, and he helped to fill this dry land. As God looked down and reflected on all that God was creating, one word came to mind: good. It was very good. On the fourth day of creation, God made the stars and the moon. And as God put these things into the sky, God once again said, "It is good." On the fifth day of creation, God decided to fill the earth a little fuller. God created the great sea animals and all the tiny living things that swarm in the waters. On the fifth day of creation, God created all the winged birds and blessed these creatures and told them to multiply. Again, on the fifth day, God said that it was good. Then on the sixth day of creation, God made every kind of wildlife, every kind of livestock, every kind of creature that crawls on the ground. And God saw how good it was. Then on the sixth day, God said, "Let us make humanity in our image to resemble us, so that they may take charge of the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, the wildlife and the livestock, all of the earth, all of the crawling things on the earth." So God created humanity in God's own image. In the divine image, God created them, male and female. God created them. God blessed them and said to them, to the humans, "Be fertile and multiply, fill the earth, master it, take charge of the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, and everything crawling on the ground." God saw everything that God had created, and it was supremely good. There was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. May God bless our understanding of the word. This story of creation is one of the first ones that I learned as a child. Perhaps it's because it is the first story in the Bible, or perhaps it's simply because it is a really, really good story, not just for children, but for all of us. And as the story was told, I remember my anticipation would build as the world became fuller and fuller of life. Listening to this story, I would wait anxiously for the mountains and then the trees, and then the zebras and the fish, for the clownfish and the zebras and the goats and the giraffes, and finally, me, you, us, humanity, human beings. God created us male and female, created equally, both of us in God's image. We as human beings were created in God's image, and we are part of the creation that God called supremely good. Now, throughout history, this creation story has been referred to quite a bit. And throughout history, this creation story has often been used to shape Western Eurocentric worldviews about humans' role in creation. It shaped how we are called to understand ourselves and to relate to both the earth and to the animals. Western interpretations of this passage have often suggested that we, as humans, were the pinnacle of God's creation. In this story of 7 days, God saved the best for last. And not only that, but God gave us, human beings, a task and a purpose, a vocation. We are called to master the earth, to take charge of the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the livestock. We are to master the earth, these interpretations said, and all within it. Western Eurocentric interpretations of this story have often put human beings at the center. And these interpretations, which focus on taking charge, mastering the earth, and human beings' dominion, have often laid the theological foundation for practices and doctrines of domination, control, and exploitation of the land, of animals, and even of people. Now, growing up, I wasn't taught that specific interpretation of this passage. When I was taught this story, I was told that as human beings, we were to be stewards of the earth. We were to be caretakers of our common household, that we have a responsibility to care for creation as God cares for us. And yet, even in this interpretation, this more generous one, what I've come to realize that even within it, there is still an inherent hierarchy, a superiority, a separation between humans and the rest of creation. Even this well-meaning interpretation, which kind of lends itself to stewardship, still suggests a one-directional flow of power, of knowledge, and of relationship that sets us apart from creation. This interpretation still centers humanity in the story, and holds on to human control. As Paul mentioned last week, Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a mother, writer, scientist, professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which again we'll be gathering to read in just a couple of weeks, she looks not only at the second account of creation, but also the first one too. And she notes that in Western traditions, in this first account of creation, human beings are often seen as the crowning jewel of God's creation. And the story is often read in which there is an implied hierarchy, with human beings at the top, animals at the middle, and plants all the way at the bottom, in this hierarchy of creation. She notes that this isn't the case for Indigenous communities. She writes, in native ways of knowing, human beings are often referred to as the younger brothers of creation. We say that humans have the least experience with how to live, and thus the most to learn. We must look to our teachers among other species for guidance. Their wisdom is apparent in how they live. They teach us to live by example. They've been on the earth far longer than we have been and have had time to figure things out. Indigenous wisdom focuses on a community of creation of which human beings are only a small, small part. Animals are not beasts, but brothers. The land is a living being. Water is life. Creation speaks. The wind sings. Philosopher Derek Rasmussen asked the rhetorical question, what makes a people indigenous? To which he responds, Indigenous people believe they belong to the land, and non-Indigenous people believe that the land belongs to them. Indigenous people believe they belong to the land, and non-Indigenous people believe the land belongs to them. Colonialism refers to the practice of countries invading, conquering, and exploiting lands, natural resources, and people for their own economic benefit. European countries began engaging in colonialism as early as the 15th century, with support from the church under the Doctrine of Discovery. Today, many countries, including the United States, continue to engage in colonialist and neo-colonialist practices, not only here at home, but around the world. Our history here in the United States is one of a particular type of colonialism called settler colonialism. Settler colonialism refers to how an invading group of people conquer a land and then they settle in it. Rather than taking the spoils and then returning home, they never leave. And by doing so, the original population, the indigenous population, is simultaneously displaced and replaced. Indigenous people in this system are forced to convert and to adopt the cultural, religious, and other types of cultural norms of the dominating group, or else be destroyed. Settler colonialism, which focuses on domination and control and mastery of the earth and the people within it, is an ongoing system of domination and control, and it has been baked into our country's identity, laws, beliefs, practices, and even our very own behaviors. It perpetuates both the repression and oppression of Indigenous people, both in history and today. As Reverend Mark Charles, a Navajo pastor, notes, you cannot understand the history, or our history as a country, until you understand the history of the church. You cannot understand our history as a country until you understand the history of the church. Throughout the history, colonialism and the church have went together like hand in glove. And yet, there is another way. Last week, I had the pleasure of talking with Reverend Ron McKinney and Reverend Danelle Crawford McKinney. They are both Presbyterian pastors who live and work in Lawrence, Kansas. They're both employed at Haskell Indian Nations University. Pastor Ron has been involved in the denomination's work to repudiate the doctrine of discovery and to begin to acknowledge and make amends for the PCUSA's involvement in practices of colonialism, including the use of boarding schools. Pastor Danelle serves on the board of directors of Presbyterian Women, and both of them have been very involved in youth ministry, especially with Native American youth. In our conversation, we spent time talking about the doctrine of discovery and the effects of colonization, which continue to affect Indigenous communities and white communities today. We also talked about the strength and resilience of Indigenous communities, and throughout the entire conversation, I was struck by their faith. I was struck by how Pastor Danelle and Ron's faith has been informed and shaped not only by the Christian tradition, but by Indigenous wisdom. I was deeply moved by how they talked about their relationship to creation and our shared Creator. And I was deeply moved by the ways in which they suggested by adopting a more Indigenous approach, perhaps we can begin the process of repairing and restoring our relationships to creation, our Creator, and one another as we seek to move forward in a different way. I invite you now to watch some of this conversation with the McKinneys and myself, and to take time to listen to their wisdom, their challenge, and their invitation. All right, Jimmy, go ahead and roll that video.
Okay, I'll go first. My name is Danelle Crawford McKinney. I am an enrolled member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Dakota Oyate, which if you've heard of the Lakota people, we are the Dakota people. And so I originate from Minnesota, but our people were moved over to South Dakota. And if you think of South Dakota as being split up by the Missouri River, anyone who lives on the west side is known as Lakota. Anyone living on the east side is known as Dakota. I live on the east side of South Dakota, way up in the northeast corner.
I'm Ron McKinney, and I come from southeastern Oklahoma. I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I grew up in a church that was one of the first churches established after our people traveled from our homelands to the new territory, which is now Oklahoma. On the Trail of Tears. My family still worships there and kind of our home church. So.
And where is home for you right now?
Lawrence, Kansas. Yeah, we're here in Lawrence.
Yeah. Ron, you mentioned a little bit about your work with the PCUSA and repudiating the doctrine of discovery. Could you share a little bit about what the doctrine of discovery is for folks who may be unfamiliar with it?
Okay. Well, it's got a history that goes way back. And basically what it was giving justification and authorization for explorers to go out into the world and to claim lands of people to subjugate people that of that land that may not be Christians. So if they weren't Christianized, then they had the authority to go in and take that land and begin that process. So in a nutshell, that's how it started. But throughout the course of history here in the United States, that has been upheld. It has been affirmed in the court system. So it became relied upon in several key court cases involving land transactions between Native Americans and outside groups, other countries. And so the court has upheld that ruling even though that was a religious doctrine, you know. And so even as late as 2005, it was used in a court case with the Oneidas, who were fighting with about taxation on their indigenous lands. The effects that it has had has been tremendous on our people, all ever since, you know, from the very beginning, because of this idealism that church had the right to come in and to take things, take land, take resources, and subjugate the people.
A little bit about what the PCUSA's role in that was with boarding schools or in any other areas. Was the PCUSA involved in that, or what do we know about that piece?
Well, and that was the whole idea of everything, was to Christianize the native, the indigenous people.
Yeah.
And so in the beginning, like with my tribe, the particular tribe, the Choctaws, the missionaries that came among our people in the early 1800s, they did a good job of living with the people, living among them, translating the parts of the Bible, and really learning the language. But over time, between kind of hand-in-hand work with the government and the church, the boarding schools became the place where a lot of these atrocities began to happen. The whole point was to Christianize the indigenous people and make them more European-like, you know, cut the hair, stop speaking the language, dress wear, and stop traditional practices and cultural ways, and learn this new American customs and ways of living, and speaking only English. And so at one point, it was the church that was involved in that because they were the ones in control of those schools. Eventually, the government took that back over and continued to propagate that and continued to do that well into the, you know,
even today.
Yeah, even today, this, you know, that still goes on.
And can you talk a little bit about what the lasting impact of some of those colonial and boarding school practices are?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, my family line, we used to have medicines in our care. And we, you know, there was such a division that our family was told, you either walk the traditional way or you walk the reformed traditional way. And so our family members buried that. And so for years we tried to deny that we were, you know, associated as Native Indigenous people, because we knew that in just 2 generations ago, people were sabotaged for being that, having those beliefs, because they believed that we were savages, that we weren't Christianized. So it's taken me years throughout my life to be able to say that it's okay for me to recognize that there are some Indigenous teachings that are important, not just for myself, but for the future generations to come. I can't deny myself as an Indigenous person, nor can I deny myself the Reformed tradition teachings. There's no way I can just separate them out. So we have to figure out a way to move forward with both teachings, because we can always increase who we are by having both of those.
And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about some of the statements the PCUSA has made and some of the actions the church is trying to take to address those harms.
Briefly, some of the things that we were trying to accomplish were the land acknowledgements, to say for churches to realize that at one point where their building is, where their worship community is, was on native land, on indigenous land. Whether those people are still there or not, it's an acknowledgement that they were there, because why aren't they there anymore? You know, that's a question. It was a call for mid-level councils to be able to begin to do that process, and many churches have. There are pockets where many churches have taken this on, doing land acknowledgements whenever they meet for presbytery meetings. That was one aspect of it, because a lot of times what happens is there's so many areas in the country where that native presence isn't there, isn't visible. I mean, sometimes it's there,
Yeah.
but it's not recognized and it's not
Yeah.
highly visible. You know, like I said, there's pockets where if you don't stop and think about where you're at, you forget that, you know, out of sight, out of mind. We don't have natives here, you know, but if you look at the names of the towns and the creeks and the rivers and the mountains in those regions, a lot of them have native names. And so why is that? Just to be able to have people and churches, communities to recognize that people were there.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to recognize that, you know, to some people, a land acknowledgement seem like something where, oh, well, you know, we're reminding people of what they took from us. But it's not what that's about. Indigenous people are very connected to everything around us. We're connected to the people, we're connected to the water, to the air, to the ground we walk on. We're connected to everything. You know, the people that lived here, we were more than just inhabitants. We had a relationship with Mother Earth. The earth was called our mother, and everything about her was something that we had a relationship with. And I think it's important for people to understand that when we do a land acknowledgement, we're honoring the animals that sustain us. We are honoring the water that's a living being that that gives us life. That's why you hear the saying "Mini Wichoni." It means the water of life. I think that's an important aspect of recognizing that, and it's more of a connection than people would understand or realize.
Yeah. Something that really grounds you in your faith there from the Bible or tradition or theology.
Well, for me, it's Isaiah 40:31. We will mount on wings as eagles. And so we believe that when we see an eagle, that there's good news coming our way. Every time I see one, or I have had something significant happen in my life, it was an eagle that brought that message to me. And so that's why I appreciate that line.
For me, a lot of people don't realize that southeastern Oklahoma, there's a lot of mountains there. It's mountainous and covered with evergreens and interdispersed with hardwood trees. But when I go home, the route we take, we go over the mountains to get there. And so I always think of Psalm 121, you know, from where I look to the hills, where will my help come from? So whenever I'm going home, I feel like in the journey, I'm gaining strength because I'm remembering the people and the sites and locations that are there.
So for folks who are wondering, you know, what do Indigenous communities look like today? What would you want people to know about those communities, recognizing they're diverse and that no two are the same?
One of the things that I've noticed, gosh, just in the last 5 years or so, what has really changed in the dynamic of Indigenous people is recognizing that we are very diverse, but yet we are very connected to each other. There was protests going on at Standing Rock regarding the water supply, the aquifer where the Dakota Access Pipeline was coming through. There were people from all over the world that came and supported what happened. And I think people started to see that, you know, even though we may be small in number in the communities that we live in, bonding together makes us even stronger than what we were. I think people are starting to recognize their voice. And I don't know if you've seen in the brief statement of faith of the Presbyterian Church, there's a line in there that says, "To hear the people's long silenced." And that line was written by Reverend Dr. Henry Fawcett. We were so proud of his contribution to that, because that's how we felt for so long, that our voices were silenced. And now they're not anymore. We're starting to recognize that we have a voice, that we have, you know, and we are resilient, and that we have a mission for the future of our people.
And I think it's important to remember that we're still here. And it's important for the church to recognize that we're still here. We may not be dressed in regalia and doing our dances and cultural things. We may be dressed as educators. We may be dressed as doctors, as lawyers, as whatever it is, but we're still here. It's been, this fight for over 500 years of getting that kind of recognition.
Thank you, Pastor Ron and Pastor Danelle. And I want to also thank them for joining us this morning for worship and being part of our worship service today. In 2016, the Peace USA repudiated the doctrine of discovery, and 3 years ago, I guess, in 2018, our General Assembly received a report that shared important next steps for our denomination, as well as local congregations to begin to take. These actions were not an ending, but a beginning, an opening, an opportunity to begin to listen to voices long silenced, to begin to live in different relationship with our Creator, creation, and with one another. Throughout this Lenten series, Second is providing opportunities for you to go a little bit deeper as we begin to think of different ways of living with the earth and one another, as we begin to think about how we can decolonize our faith. This afternoon, as Jimmy mentioned, we'll be having a land acknowledgement workshop on Zoom from 1 to 3. We invite you to join us if you're able to. And then again, on March 21st, Pastor Danelle will be leading a workshop right after worship at 11 o'clock. In today's worship email, we'll also be providing additional resources and educational opportunities, and we invite you to take advantage of both of those.